Hey, what's the worst case scenario for Syria? ISIS, right? Yeah, those guys suck. And unfortunately, might be making a little bit of a comeback in kind of the chaos that is the aftermath of the fall of the Assad regime. So that's what we're going to get into today, unfortunately. But first, let's start out with something a little lighter, I think, maybe. I don't know. Or dark, depending on how you view this. Look, CNN aired a segment last week where they had their chief international correspondent or somebody go into a prison. And long story short, it looks like it was entirely staged. Fake, start to finish. Now, it's not clear if CNN knew it was fake or if it was the HTS guys on site that wanted to put this show on, or who knows. But what happened is after this video came out and it got a lot of attention, like a ton of traction across the internet, understandably so, because it's, a really compelling story. This reporter goes into a jail cell and frees this man who says he's been held captive by Assad's forces for 7 months. Who doesn't want to see that? It makes you feel good, right? Didn't take long, and we had Syrian sources on the ground saying, wait a minute, this man is actually, and I hope I pronounce this correctly, Salama Mohammed Salama, a former first lieutenant in Syria's Air Force intelligence. And then, of course, pictures of him started to emerge. Now, this is not, I don't mean this as a pat on my back as much as all of us who are kind of following this war probably would have seen the same thing. I talked about this in a podcast called Unclassified last Friday, as this was coming out, saying it doesn't look right. Something about this doesn't fit, right? We've all seen the countless videos of prisoners being released and family members kind of storming these facilities, trying to find their loved ones, and the white helmets going through Sednaya specifically and saying, we put dogs everywhere we could. There's no one else there. So the idea that after all of that in some prisons, all of a sudden in this one, there's just a clean cell with one dude well lit, and he comes out looking pretty cleanly nice new clothes, right? His hands were relatively clean. He walked right outside and was ready to do an interview. Start to finish felt weird. I'm sure you all, if you saw it, probably picked up on that as well, but what a mess. All right, so let's get dark here, unfortunately. ISIS, Islamic State, been a major problem throughout much of the world, a big issue in Syria, of course, especially during the onset of the Syrian civil war. They haven't really been doing much since kind of the fighting kicked off. HTS-led opposition forces kicked off the fighting near Aleppo a couple weeks ago. Unfortunately, we are starting to see more and more activity on that front, especially in some of the desert areas of eastern Syria. Now, a positive note here, the United States has increased kinetic activity against ISIS elements in the country. Just 2 days ago, U.S. Central Command put out a note saying that they conducted precision airstrikes targeting known ISIS camps and operatives in Syria, killing 12 ISIS terrorists. They say the recent strikes are in former Assad regime and Russian-controlled areas, and they wanted to do this to ensure pressure is maintained on ISIS. They say battle damage assessments are underway, and there are no indications of civilian casualties. General Michael Kurilla, the head of U.S. Central Command, said, quote, CENTCOM, working with allies and partners in the region, will not allow ISIS to reconstitute and take advantage of the current situation in Syria. Now, you'll notice there that the United States is striking not just in areas that they and SDF forces hold in the eastern, northeastern portions of Syria, but they're starting to strike into areas previously controlled, to a degree, by the Assad regime and Russian forces. So as those groups lost the ability to effectively patrol that territory, the U.S. is kind of stepping in to the limited degree they can with, all things considered, minimal assets in the region, or at least in Syria, to try to affect the fight against ISIS so they can't fully reconstitute. Now, turning to one of the analysts that I trust very much in this conflict, Charles Lister wrote a recent piece for the New York Times titled, With al-Assad Gone, the Risk of ISIS Resurgence Grows, where he says, while the group has lost almost all of what it once called its caliphate, its threat has not dissipated. On the contrary, the Islamic State has conducted nearly 700 attacks in Syria since January, by my calculations, putting it on track to triple its rate of last year. The sophistication and deadliness of ISIS attacks have also surged this year, as has their geographic spread. Now, one thing worth noting here, and of course this article and any articles I reference will be linked in the description below, we have to think about the quantity of munitions that may have become available to ISIS during the fall of the Assad regime. We're seeing that the Assad forces just fled, right? How many planes, helicopters, missile silos, small arms depots quickly fell into the hands of HTS, and for what it's worth, a lot of those ended up quickly being destroyed by Israeli airstrikes. But nonetheless, what was ISIS able to get their hands on? And you have to imagine there's a couple areas out there in the eastern portion of the desert that they maybe were able to kind of pilfer and acquire some materials. But more on that here in a moment. He says countering the Islamic State is not straightforward, and it requires a complex set of interconnected responses, not just military action. After all, ISIS has always been a symptom of the chaos wrought by Syria's civil war, not a cause. It relies on instability, human suffering, and local grievances to fuel its narrative, drive its recruitment, and justify its actions. To prevent ISIS from filling vacuums left by President Assad's fall, the United States and its allies must use every tool available to fight its resurgence. Now, for what it's worth, a personal opinion, in reading this article, there was a lot of kind of lobbying to make sure that the United States keeps troops on the ground in Syria. We've got something like 900 right now. And I know with the Trump administration coming in a few weeks here, that's been one of their points, is talking about pulling U.S. troops out from Syria and other places around the world. So I did kind of notice a thread of that, of saying, don't abandon Syria right now. We need the troops there, and maybe even making the argument to put additional resources in there for the short term. They say Assad regime forces, who had been trying to fend off the Islamic State's desire to expand, have abandoned their positions in central Syria. Syrian opposition fighters have already sought to fill some of the space, but their numbers are minimal, and their capacity to coordinate a complex desert campaign against the Islamic State is limited at best. The first U.S. response to this sudden vacuum came last Sunday, when American aircraft struck more than 75 ISIS targets throughout central Syria. The U.S. military will need to remain vigilant in the coming weeks, primed to strike ISIS where it seeks to amass resources, regroup, or launch attacks. Now, one of the things that I think is worth considering here is HTS now has control of Syria by and large, or at least the majority of Syria, right? They clearly don't have a portion down in the southwest where Israel has moved into the buffer zone, and the SNA and SDF do still control areas in the north and northeast, respectively. That said, while HTS technically has control over the majority of Syria, we cannot assume that this militia force, as it was just a couple weeks ago, is all of a sudden able to coordinate a large-scale campaign against an international terrorist organization, right? It just can't, right? So we're seeing them able to put up checkpoints and police the cities that they're in, but the effort needed to kind of clamp down on a group like Islamic State is a long time coming. HTS is nowhere near that right now. So it makes sense that we're starting to see some of these pockets with Islamic State forces kind of beginning to regroup. Lister says, for the past 8 years, the United States has partnered with the Syrian Democratic Forces, a Kurdish-led coalition that paved the way for the fall of the Islamic State in Raqqa in 2017. The SDF is now facing a potentially crucial moment. The Syrian National Army, or SNA, a Turkish-bashed rival militia grouping, has captured strategic towns from the SDF and may now have the symbolic Kurdish city of Kobani in its sights. A U.S.-mediated ceasefire between these two warring factions was reached on Tuesday, it's last Tuesday, but is fragile. They say as of Friday, SDF's tenuous control over its territory shows signs of faltering. Protests against the SDF in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor descended into violence and chaos, with reports of SDF firing on civilians. And this is something I need to get a better grasp on myself. There have been reports of civilians protesting the SDF for a while now, like since before the offensive that eventually toppled the Assad regime. And personally, I've kind of lost track of that in the grand scheme of things here. But there have been kind of continual reports, videos, and pictures coming out showing the civilians in some of those areas pushing back against SDF. So again, while the Assad regime is gone, it's not like it's rainbows and unicorns throughout the rest of the country. They say amid all of this change and uncertainty lies the detainee crisis in northeastern Syria, where tens of thousands of ISIS male prisoners and associated women and children languish in SDF-administered detention facilities. These detainees must be returned to their places of origin and, when appropriate, should be prosecuted for their crimes they committed while associated with the Islamic State. But the many children in the camps deserve a chance at a new life. That's a headache, because these aren't all Syrians either. You've got people that came in from all different countries, many regionally, but some not, some from around the world. How do you handle that, right? This is an international problem. It's one of the reasons that we've seen such broad coalitions come together to combat the Islamic State. It's not that, well, there's a lot of different reasons, but this is kind of a key one, right? Members of the Islamic State are coming from all around the world. You really need the entire world coming together to figure out, what do we do with those tens of thousands of prisoners? Because if you just let them loose, who knows, right? Maybe a couple of them have changed their ways and will just go about trying to make an honest living. But of course, you're not going to risk that, especially as HTS is just getting their feet under them, trying to operate the Syrian government. Now, turning to some words here from the commander-in-chief of the Syrian Democratic Forces, General Abdi Mazloum. He said, quote, ISIS is now stronger in the Syrian desert. Probably they were in remote areas and hiding, but now they have greater freedom of movement since they face no issues with other groups and are not engaged in conflict with them. In the areas under our control, their activities have also increased. Just a few days ago, 3 members of the internal security forces were killed in an ISIS operation. He says, at the moment, joint operations against ISIS are halted. This is not a decision, but rather a military reality, as the coalition is also preoccupied with the ongoing conflict. Therefore, I stress that if these attacks persist, joint operations will remain suspended. So again, the SDF is trying to combat Islamic State, but they're also having to deal with the SNA, right? The Turkish-backed militias kind of pushing back against them in portions of northeastern Syria. The commander also warned here that it's possible that some of these detention camps and prison facilities might be besieged. Some of the most hardline Islamic State operatives are in some of those prisons. It'd be a huge propaganda win if they were able to be broken out. And he says, quote, frankly, there is currently a significant threat to the security of these detention centers. Look, I don't want to be pessimistic, but I feel like it wouldn't be out of the blue if we find out that there was a prison break and a bunch of Islamic State militants and their families all just scattered across portions of central and eastern Syria. I feel like that could very easily be a headline in the next couple weeks. Hopefully not, and it does look like right now the United States, SDF, and some other partners are trying to clamp down on this, but it is festering right now and could very quickly go in the wrong direction. Now, just a couple days ago, we also did get what I think is the first message from Assad since he fled Syria back on December 8th on or about. It hasn't been verified, but it's being considered verified for what it's worth. It apparently came out on Assad's Telegram channel. And I'm going to read through portions of this here. It's something, so be ready. He says, first, my departure from Syria was neither planned nor did it occur during the final hours of the battles, as some have claimed. On the contrary, I remained in Damascus, carrying out my duties until the early hours of Sunday, the 8th of December, 2024. As terrorist forces infiltrated Damascus, I moved to Latakia in coordination with our Russian allies to oversee combat operations. Upon arrival at the Hamanim Air Base, that I feel like I'm mispronouncing that every single time. Hamanim, I'm going with that. If I'm wrong, I'm sorry. Those letters together hurt my brain every time I see it. So, Hamanim, maybe we'll try. He said it became clear that our forces had completely withdrawn from all the battle lines and that the last army positions had fallen. As the field situation in the area continued to deteriorate, the Russian military base itself came under intensified attack by drone strikes. With no viable means of leaving the base, Moscow requested that the base's command arrange an immediate evacuation to Russia on the following evening of Sunday, the 8th of December. This took place a day after the fall of Damascus, following the collapse of the final military positions and the resulting paralysis of all remaining state institutions. So real quick, and there's more from Assad here in a second, but I thought it was interesting how he presented this as, look, I was there the entire time. Like, I was there until the country fell. We just couldn't do anything about it. And then Russia said, you got to get out. It wasn't even my choice. I had to go. So I don't necessarily know what I would have expected if it would have been anything different than this, but that's how Assad is kind of painting his last moments in Syria. And wrapping up, he said, quote, I have never sought positions for personal gain, but have always considered myself as a custodian of a national project, supported by the faith of the Syrian people who believed in its vision. I've carried an unwavering conviction in their will and ability to protect the state, defend its institutions, and uphold their choices to the very last moment. Look, I don't know, like, if that's just delusional or what. Right? I mean, are you seeing the people in Syria? We'll put up some videos here, the people celebrating across the country that Assad is gone. It's hard to, I don't understand, like, how much of a bubble he must have been in. And as a dictator, that can happen, of course. But, like, to look at what he was doing in Syria and say, hey, I didn't do anything for my own personal gain. I was just there on behalf of the people, wanting to do what the people wanted until the last moment. Pretty clearly, we can see at this point that the people wanted Assad gone, and that's what ended up happening. Now, speaking of Assad, we are starting to see more and more evidence come out of the crimes committed by he and his regime over, well, not just his regime, but his family's regime over the last 50 years. And there was an article that just came out where they said that what we see coming out of Syria in the next couple of years could be bigger than Nuremberg. Those are the trials that put the Nazis on the stand for the Holocaust following World War II, and a lot of other crimes. But, like, to give you an idea, to compare anything to that gives you an idea of the scope of this, but I think they actually make a pretty rational argument. We're going to dive into that here. It's not just hyperbole. So they say the Assad Archive has been amassed over the last 13 years by a Canadian lawyer and war crimes investigator, Bill Wiley, 61, and his team of Syrians on the ground who took astonishing risks to gather the evidence and smuggle it out. Disguised as shepherds and traders, using everything from trucks to rafts, they moved entire filing cabinets of paperwork through checkpoints. One paid with his life, killed by the regime, while another was injured and kidnapped by a rebel group. Several had to be taken out of the country to safety. Some papers had to be left in hiding places as it was too dangerous to move them. Despite the risks, hundreds of kilos at a time were brought out to be digitally scanned and analyzed by Wiley's organization, the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, funded by the British, German, and U.S. governments. It's a lot of stuff they've gotten out. And there's a lot of attention on this right now because there's been so much drastic change. But I do want to remind people that this is a conflict that's been going on for a long time. And the Syrian civil war itself is 10 plus years in the making, right? But we have to remember that a lot of what they're getting into here did not start in 2011. It was well before that, right? We're talking about decades of oppression at the hands of the Assad regime. They say the Assad regime documented everything, and a chain of command signed off on what some have called a bureaucracy of death. Quote, "This is the most documented repression in history," said Wiley, "like the Nazis, but with computers." They say, indeed, Assad's father Hafez, who ruled from 1970 to 2000, is said to have been advised in torture methods by a former Nazi, Alois Brunner, A-L-O-I-S Brunner, who sought refuge in Damascus, having served as a deputy to the Holocaust architect Adolf Eichmann. That's a whole rabbit hole to go down. I know it sounds a little bit crazy, but there's some truth to that. Brunner did end up in Damascus after World War II. I have not gone down that particular rabbit hole. I imagine there's some dark reading in that direction. But they say these documents tell the story of a dictatorship that carried out 50 years of incarcerations, executions, disappearances, sexual abuse, using objects and setting fire to testicles, and chemical weapon strikes on their own people. No one knows how many people they killed. The United Nations estimates that since 2011, more than 300,000 civilians have lost their lives, and at least 100,000 Syrian civilians, have been forcibly disappeared. That number, I feel like, is absolutely crazy. And again, we've talked about it in a couple of videos, but the idea that people are just disappeared, right? They're taken on their way to school or on their way back from work or on, at the market, and they just get snatched up by Syrian intelligence for questioning, and their family has no idea, right? They just all of a sudden aren't home one day, and that was 8 years ago. That's wild. And it's hard to imagine living like that. And I'm so happy for the Syrian people that hopefully those days are behind them, and hopefully they'll get a little bit of closure as to what happened to some of their loved ones. They say they also photographed them. In August 2013, a Syrian military photographer codenamed Caesar smuggled out around 55,000 pictures. His team photographed corpses of detainees, sometimes as many as 50 a day, delivered to military hospitals from security services. Each corpse had a unique 4-digit number scrawled on tape on the forehead with a thick marker pen. Another number signified the intelligence branch in which the individual had been killed. Many had been beaten, mutilated, burnt, shot, and in some cases, even melted. And then wrapping up here, he says, quote, "You are talking about 50 years of terror and so many killed and tortured that needs a massive structure. This is going to be much bigger than Nuremberg." And again, we are starting to see a lot of that evidence come together. Fortunately, there's some concern right now that in the chaos, the elation, understandably so, of people moving into some of these locations, trying to find their loved ones, that evidence might be getting trampled and lost and stolen to a degree, right? Without people really thinking about that and the impact it would have on trying to bring Assad and some of his henchmen to justice later on. But there already have been, I think it was this organization sent in like 50 remote scanners right away, like free, right? Get in, start scanning those documents, start organizing them so we have something to go off of when hopefully these war crimes trials come together. Now, I feel like we should mention Russia real quick. There's not a lot of news on that front. Technically, they're still in Syria. Technically, there's still talks ongoing about maybe they'll be able to keep their bases. Again, I'm going to butcher this one, and you're probably going to laugh because I'm probably going to pronounce it a different way than I did just a few minutes ago, but Hamanem Air Base, where the Russians have assets right now, and then the Tartus port in the Mediterranean. We're seeing satellite imagery, updated satellite imagery of both of those right now, showing like they're staging equipment to be evacuated. This kind of suggests that there's at least some degree of their troops they're going to be leaving. It's just, look, airfields don't look like that and ports don't look like that in normal day-to-day operations. That's what it looks like when you're kind of prepping each of those locations to move a lot of things out at once. So again, not a lot of updates on that front, but I feel like it's worth bringing up because it is a pretty big story, all things considered. Now, I did want to spend a few minutes here getting into kind of the HTS governance piece, which continues to be a question. I would argue right now we are still seeing a lot of positive steps from HTS when you consider what the alternative could be. And we did start this video with Islamic State. They're not there, right? And we're actually going to talk about how they fought Islamic State at times and try to put them down and push them out of any sort of governance. But still a lot of questions as to how HTS will actually operate when they're in charge of the country. And there's a good article here talking about their ideologue named Abdul Rahman Atun, who's the top jurist and strategist within HTS. They say, as the head of the HTS Sharia Council and a close confidant of the group's leader, Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, Atun plays a critical role in shaping the group's ideological, religious, and political strategies, or justifying them. He says his influence has been pivotal as HTS transitions away from its roots as an al-Qaeda affiliate towards a localized insurgency with aspirations of international legitimacy. They say Atun has consistently advocated for a shift away from transnational extremist objectives, focusing instead on localized governance and stability in the regions that HTS controls. For anybody who's been watching these videos for the last couple weeks now, that's generally what we're hammering on. That is the message that HTS keeps putting out. From what we've seen at this point, they are walking that walk. The big question is, will they continue to do that? And the indications are yes, but, be cautious. They say Atun's pragmatic approach is epitomized by his endorsement of the Taliban model, a strategy that he believes can help HTS secure international recognition, drawing inspiration from the Taliban's successful negotiations with Western powers and eventual return to governance in Afghanistan. Atun has argued that HTS should adopt a similar path by prioritizing local governance, engaging diplomatically, and marginalizing extremist factions. Look, personally, no big fan of the Taliban. Got some personal beef there that goes back a little ways, but it's interesting to see the Taliban model being presented as a viable option for an extremist organization coming to power, right? I would argue that the Taliban hasn't done all of that. While they are generally domestically focused and they are engaging diplomatically, the Taliban at this point has really not done a very good job of marginalizing extremist factions. So hopefully HTS makes a break from that model of this Taliban model and actually does work to expel aspects of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. But that is a portion that this article hits on. They say HTS has also targeted rival extremist factions to consolidate power and enforce its localized agenda. For example, the group has cracked down on remnants of Daesh, which is actually the Arabic abbreviation for Islamic State. So you know how we say ISIS? Those same letters, if you will, when it's in Arabic is Daesh. And I feel like I never can pronounce that right, but when I hear native speakers say that term, it like hits in the gut. It's understandable why they would use that term. It doesn't sound good at all. But anyways, Daesh and al-Qaeda affiliates like Huras al-Din, as well as smaller foreign-led factions such as Jund al-Sham. These groups, often linked to al-Qaeda or other global networks, have been systematically marginalized or expelled from HTS-controlled areas. Atun has argued that such factions undermine HTS's objectives and tarnish its efforts to present itself as a nationalist force. I mean, yeah, of course, that makes sense, right? It's a pretty pragmatic approach. From the outside looking in, we can see, how many times in the last few weeks have you heard these guys referred to as Al-Qaeda or Islamic State linked as an effort to delegitimize them or say why they're bad or worse than Assad or shouldn't be supported or anything, right? From their point of view, of course, they want to separate themselves as much as possible from any of those groups that in the Western point of view are very, very bad. And when it comes to Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, they are very, very bad. It's not just a perception thing. But they say, despite HTS efforts to rebrand itself, Atun's public statements sometimes revealed contradictions. While advocating for normalization with Western countries and urging the removal of HTS from terrorist blacklists, Atun has also delivered inflammatory rhetoric against the West. In a 2021 Telegram post, Atun described the United States as a, quote, enemy of the Islamic nation and criticized its support for Israel. He delivered several speeches on Gaza, one of which included the statement, quote, we hate everyone against the Sunnis, America and Israel, the criminal Bashar regime, Iran and Russia, and all the traitorous rulers who failed Gaza, adding, from Idlib to Gaza, the wound is won. So yeah, a little sketchy background, to say the least, for this group, but also I don't think that's surprising to anyone, again, given past affiliations with Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. So, I'll say the jury's still out, right? We're hopeful that HTS will prove to be more moderate going forward than they were in the past, but all we can really do, you and I sitting here, is watch and see how this plays out. And then in wrapping up here real quick, I wanted to touch on the Israeli actions in the southwestern portion of Syria, kind of moving into that buffer zone. Some statements here from the Israeli chief of the general staff who said, quote, we've been here for almost a week. The main reason is the security of the country. We're here to defend along the border in the Golan Heights, northern Golan Heights, and Mount Hermon. There was a country here that was an enemy state. Its army collapsed. And there's a threat that the terrorist elements could reach here. We move forward so these terrorist elements will not establish themselves. Extremist terrorists will not be able to establish themselves right next to our border. We are not intervening in what is happening in Syria. We have no intention of managing Syria. We are unequivocally intervening in what determines the security of Israeli citizens. Additionally, over the last couple days, the Israeli Air Force has struck a multitude of targets across Syria. We're talking about significant damage to what was previously Syria's most strategic weapons, airfields with aircraft, helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft destroyed all across the country, naval bases with ships in port sunk on the spot. We've seen quite a few manufacturing facilities, weapon storage facilities, underground launch locations, and mobile rocket launchers all destroyed. In fact, Israel says that over the course of the past week or so, they have eliminated upwards of 90% of Syria's air defense capabilities. So again, it's a lot. It's chaotic. There's a lot happening in this conflict, but hopefully that helped to break it down just a little bit to better understand what's going on. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.